Let me first start off with a brief statement. I'm not against leveling systems. I'm not against progression systems. I do think they can work in this game with adjustments, but they do not work in the game currently and are detrimental to the gameplay experience in the current iteration of the game. A progression system is a method of advancing a player character from one power state or capability state to another power or capability state. For example, leveling up is a part of the progression system. Going from light, medium, and heavy armor is a part of the progression system. Unlocking recipes is a part of the progression system. Pretty much every single thing you do in this game is in some way tied to the progression system, but isn't necessarily mechanically embedded within the progression system. A linear progression system is a system in which there is a de facto or de jure endpoint. De jure in this context means it's a matter of fact that there's only one endpoint, and de facto in this context means that you might have a non-linear progression system that has multiple start and end points, but due to the game balance, there's only one viable endpoint. Does Conan Exiles have a linear progression system? Absolutely. There are many ways that Conan Exiles has a linear progression system, but the simplest way to explain it is that you have to get to a certain level before you unlock the ability to do or build most things in the game. And even though you're presented with some choices on the way, for example, what order do you get things, which weapon do you go with, and so on and so forth, the balance of the game, the fundamental gameplay mechanics, and the nature of the player interaction means that there is basically a single route to efficient power and progression in a player versus player setting. A lot of you who are playing the game currently have probably noticed a trend on your servers, especially if they are player versus player oriented. Essentially what happens is the biggest, most organized groups power level one guy to 30 so that they can make steel weapons, and then they just go shit on everyone else on the server. I'm going to try to break down the building blocks of how this negative gameplay loop came about. I'm going to use an unscientific, emotional graph to illustrate the problem I'm talking about. On the y-axis, that's up and down by the way, you have the amount of effort that's required to deal with a particular tier of building, and the scale goes from positive infinity at the top, which basically means it's impossible, and at the bottom there's negative infinity, which basically means it's trivial or requires no effort at all from the player. On the x-axis, you have the player levels. On the left you have level 0, on the right you have level 50. These lines are not graphing data, they're graphing how the game feels to me. The red line represents tier 1 buildings. Now just quickly before I continue, this graph is ignoring using exploits and stuff, so we're mostly talking about actual in-game mechanics and tools given to the player. That said, take a look at that line. It's impossible to deal with tier 1 buildings until you reach level 30. Now that in itself is not the main problem. The problem, the core, the nugget, the black hole at the center of this issue is that the second you reach level 30 and craft steel weapons is that it becomes trivial to deal with tier 1 buildings. Look at that graph dip. It feels almost laughably easy to deal with a tier 1 building the second you have a steel weapon. You can just run around a server demolishing every other single person who hasn't made it to level 30. The only defense players without tier 2 buildings have is building their base on a rock and hoping that the people with steel weapons don't bounce or exploit their way up onto your base. This is cancerous for the game in a PvP setting in my opinion, because it basically means one group gets to progress while technologically crippling everyone around them with raids, and that leads to a single group dominating the server, after which the server promptly dies. If I were to graph how much fun people were having playing this game, it would be basically flat for the entire time until they reach level 30, with the occasional spike from radiant PvP. If you're the first to hit level 30, there's a huge uptick in the amount of fun you have for a while until it flatlines again because everyone else leaves the server when they get tired of being shit on by the people who race to the top the fastest. There are other ways this is bad for the game. You've essentially locked away the most engaging and interesting part of player versus player interaction behind a massive grind wall. It's fun to raid people and get raided, provided you're on a reasonably even footing. The problem right now is that the only people who get to raid are themselves untouchable when raiding because they just have better gear, and their base is unraidable as well because they're just ahead technologically. This creates a dynamic where once you're ahead, you just stay ahead, and the only optimal choice for you to maintain that lead is to do your best to ruin the game for everyone else. Even if this particular tier 1 facet of the problem was solved, the problem would remain for tier 2 and tier 3, albeit at the deity level. The green line represents the amount of effort required to deal with tier 2 buildings, and the orange line is the amount of effort required to deal with the tier 3 buildings. Again, you see a similar pattern. It's basically impossible to deal with these buildings until you get explosive, where it takes a bit of effort, and then the second you unlock the god summoning ability, it becomes trivial again. This has a profound impact on the gameplay. There's almost no reason to even try to innovate on defensive building designs because they can be trivially wiped out at any moment. That's an entire subset of skill and knowledge right there being crippled by the progression system. There's no reason to even try to scout out enemy bases for weaknesses because you're powerless to raid them until you hit a certain point of progression, at which it becomes near trivial to raid them anyway, so you don't even need to scout. This means it feels unrewarding to raid someone because there was no challenge, so the only satisfaction you can take from it is completely wiping someone off the face of the game. If things remain like this for too long, the culture of the Conan Exiles community will be permanently damaged and skewed towards people who enjoy completely ruining the game for other people by essentially pounding them into the dirt over and over. The people who enjoy other things will drift off to other games because right now, in my opinion, the game only really appeals to people who have an abundance of time and just love shitting on other players. Almost all of these problems can be fixed by adjustments to the systems and some balance tweaks. My personal preference is to remove linear progression systems altogether, but I'm going to assume here that the developers are committed to the fundamental ideas of the current progression system, so I'm just going to offer up my feedback and feelings. The first core concept I'm going to touch on is that I believe players should be able to dictate how safe or vulnerable they are through their own actions. If you want to grind for 60 hours on rocks to have a base with 30 layers of honeycombed walls, the game should offer you that opportunity. If you want to try and build a discreet house hidden off somewhere, the game should offer you that opportunity. The game should give options to players to deal with what other players might do to them. If someone is coming to raid me, the building system should have ways for me to mitigate the risks through passive defensive design at all tiers. Things like honeycombed walls, hidden trap rooms, thralls, and so on and so forth. In the current iteration of the game, this is impossible for most players due to the interaction of steel weapons and tier 1 buildings. The second core concept is risk versus reward. If I want a payout for my actions, I believe I should have to put something on the line that I can lose. Explosives are an okay-ish example. They have their own problems that I'll talk about in future, but they'll do as an example for now. If I want your stuff, I have to put my time and effort on the line to get them. I have to go farm the materials and levels to make those explosives. Right now, for the players who reach steel weapons first, there is no risk to running around and raiding every tier 1 house on the server. Right now, for the players who are in those tier 1 houses, there is no reward because they simply can't raid the guys with steel weapons even if those guys were themselves in a tier 1 house. In my opinion, this current dynamic needs to change. In my opinion, no one should be perfectly safe due to the game mechanics. No one should be trivially weak or vulnerable due to the game mechanics. Players should have to input a lot of effort to destroy or take what other players have created. The solution, in my opinion, is to give more tools to players for raiding. Give more tools and give them earlier. Make tier 1, 2, and 3 buildings vulnerable to tier 1, 2, and 3 players. If I want to expend 8 hours of my time to vindictively chop my way through an enemy tier 3 base with a stone pickaxe because they raided me and I'm angry, the game should give me that option. Not because that will be a good option, but simply because it will mean they are not invulnerable to me and I will not feel entirely powerless. Another aspect of the solution is to make tier 1 players not be completely trivial to raid once you hit steel. There should always be an expenditure of resources or time to get another player's loot. I'm not going to go into specifics as to how this can be achieved because I think the developers and community can come up with their own ideas far better than I can. I'm good at identifying problems, patterns of negative gameplay, and talking about them, not necessarily solutions, even if I like to think my ideas are great sometimes. I think sometimes we get caught up in specific solutions to problems when it comes to giving feedback to developers when we should sit back, tell them what we're not enjoying about the game, and discuss amongst each other trying to find the best solutions to the problem. Developers are almost always listening and aware of the problems we see with the game, even if it takes them a while to find a solution. Addressing a developer directly with your solution isn't always the most effective way to get it implemented. We should talk to each other about the potential fixes to a problem on a conceptual, abstract level, and I guarantee you the developers will find amazing and valuable ideas out of those discussions rather than some iteration of the grappling hook idea, which is a valuable idea, but it might not be the solution for the game. Personally, I would like it if we could build catapults to launch each other onto those cliff bases, but I'm a bit of an oddball. I would say make Conan great again, but Conan has always been great. It's just a little rough around the edges at the moment, and I'm excited for its future. So instead I say we should make Conan greater through constructive conversation, but that's not as catchy. Thanks for watching, Exiles.